This is a public safety forum. It's August 6, 2014. It's still, I don't know, 80-something degrees outside today, so first of all, thank you for coming in on a nice afternoon. This is going to be one of those events where we hopefully have a lot of participation, a lot of questions from the audience. But before we get to that point, as we have done in a number of series, I'm Paul Evans, and this is an issues forum where we hopefully will stimulate some conversation, stimulate some questions, and perhaps even learn something together. And tonight it is a great opportunity because we have a friend and someone who I've looked up to for a number of years, Representative Jeff Barker, who is a retired lieutenant from the Portland Police, also a never retired, because Marines never retire, Marine, and legislator for a number of terms, having served as the chair of the Veterans and Emergency Management Committee when I first met him, and more currently serving on the Judiciary Committee. So tonight, what we hope we'll be able to do in terms of an issues forum is talk about public safety at the 30,000-foot level. What is public safety? What are the kinds of things that we should be focusing on? What are the kinds of things that maybe we've learned over the last several sessions? The representative will have an opportunity to present what's been going on and kind of his 30,000-foot look. I have some questions actually from some folks that were going to be panelists. Comments from Chris Brown, who used to be the superintendent of Oregon State Police, also a former sheriff out of Lane County. And we're also going to be having a lot of time for question and answer from the audience. So without further ado, here's Representative Jeff Barker coming down from Aloha to enjoy the forum tonight.
Thank you. And thank you again for everybody for being here. It is important to cover these discussions. And I was just telling somebody, Ron Goss, who we went to high school together, how every now and then you feel old. We graduated 53 years ago from Benson High School. So. But I ran, the first time I ran back in 2002, I ran in an open seat. It was a new seat just after redistricting. Worked very hard. My opponent worked very hard. And they didn't resolve that election until towards the end of November. I won by 40 votes of that. So it's very important that everybody vote and get your friends to vote. You know, it doesn't matter which way, but they need to vote. In public safety, I've been the chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and we've worked on a lot of things. One of the things that you probably saw a lot about a year or two ago was the high cost of prisons. They're anticipating having to build another prison, and they're looking at a $600 million additional expense to do that. And prisons are very expensive, but there's people who belong in prison. So what we try to do is come up with a solution to have more people sent back to the communities rather than prison, and have the local corrections people work with them. Close supervision, and to deter the crime. I mean, it isn't like we want people getting off scot-free. What we don't want is you to be a victim. I don't want to be a victim. And so sometimes it's just cognitive thinking. If you and I are walking down the street and we see a garage door, we don't think much about it. If you have the mental thinking of a thief, you think, oh, there's a lawnmower guy, probably has insurance, I'll take it. And those are the kind of small nuisance ones. The violent crimes, of course, are different. They're more calculated. But those are the kind of things you try to get people to see the error of the way of thinking. And so the next time they come down your street, in my street, they don't steal the lawnmower or something else, break into your car. Part of the highlights of that, we sent $9 million to enhance the community corrections for a total of $215 million back. We have $10 million in grants counties to reduce recidivism. Another 5 are going to kick in. 5 that will kick in February. 700,000 more for child abuse, multidisciplinary groups. That's a huge problem. And then that would come up with a total of $10.7 million. And then another $4 million for a total of $8.4 for domestic violence. And we saw, I'm from Washington County, we had several cases up there a year or two ago where the split-up's pending, and then the man would go kill the woman, kill the child. I think we had like 6 of those. And so we're trying to intervene earlier in those and get that stopped because that's such a tragic event. We're facing huge problems in smaller counties. I guess in Polk County, you're one of them with having to lay off deputies and closing the jails. It's a huge problem down south in Curry County, Jackson County. And I don't know what the solution to that is. I'm trying to work with others on that. We have to figure out something because some people say, well, they won't raise their taxes, we should just let them go. I don't believe that. I don't want any part of Oregon to be a law enforcement free zone. That won't help anything. We don't want that. If you lived there, you wouldn't want that, people in danger. So the governor, I know, is interested in that, working hard on that as well. I'm just trying to think. We did a lot of other things along the law enforcement over the last few years. Worked on child prostitution, child trafficking. In Oregon, it's one of the, on I-5 is one of the places where they bring these young girls through. You take them on a circuit to Las Vegas and California, and then up to British Columbia, Seattle. And we're trying to get that stopped as much as we can. It's very difficult. Those young girls get brainwashed, and they'll tell you that this guy pimp loves them. He's the only person ever heard about him, and they get to believe that. So at one point, there was a push to not allow the police to arrest those girls for prostitution, and I was one of the people who successfully argued, police need to get a hold of them, so we keep them away from that person long enough for them to kind of get their head straight. Not, it's not to punish the girl, because they're primarily a victim of that. They don't see themselves in that way, but that's a real problem. We were looking into drunk driving with drugs, over-the-counter drugs, and prescription drugs. That's becoming a huge problem, but it's very touchy because you don't want somebody who just accidentally takes a little extra cold medicine to get arrested for that. Usually the people who are arrested for that drink the whole bottle of cough syrup, not just a couple of teaspoons. So that's kind of a thing, a very narrow path we try to wind through. We had a case last year where a murderer from John Day murdered a police officer several years ago. And he was the town bad guy, small town bad guy. He's beating his wife. The police get a call. The officer goes to the house, knocks on the door. The guy won't let him in. He opens the door, goes in. This guy was a big logger, attacks the police officer, beat him. Took a piece of firewood and beat his head, just crushed his head. So he was part of that group. There's a group who the court said they get to have a hearing for parole. So he goes to the parole board, and because the Attorney General's office prosecuted that case, the local district attorney who is like 4 or 5 new district attorneys since that event, didn't pay any attention to it, so the prosecutors weren't there to argue against him being paroled. And he came in and said, I was at this house and I'd been drinking. And I wasn't really beating my wife. She was hysterical. I was just trying to slow her down. And then somebody came in, I didn't know who they were, a policeman in uniform. And he wrestled with me and he hit his head on the stove and he died. And I really, he's really sorry. Totally inconsistent with what happened. The parole board was going to grant him parole. And I got a call about it from the police up there. And with the help of the governor's office, well, I talked to the parole board and they said we're not going to rehear the case, but we got them to have a rehearing, and the guy did not get out on parole, Sidney Dean Porter. And one of the legislators, Sherry Springer, was actually a police officer up there to do this guy and talked about how dangerous he was. There's nothing to indicate he had changed at all. The psychiatric report showed him to still have high potential for violence, but the parole board just, for whatever reason, kind of disregarded that. We have different people on the parole board today, so we're hoping that won't happen again. We worked hard a few years ago on scrap metal theft. Had a lot of especially the farmers, where their sprinkler system would be going down to the local scrap yard for pennies on the hundreds of dollars. And so we tightened that up so that people have to have a good ID when they go in. They mail a check to somebody, so it isn't, you can't give a phony name and take cash and walk out the door. And the scrap metal dealers were very cooperative in that. They wanted to do that as well. We raised the statute on child sex abuse, statute of limitations, so that people could be prosecuted years later. And that, of course, came up, it was the Neil Goldschmidt case, former governor. And he had molested a little girl, 13 or 14, his babysitter years ago. The statute of limitations had run out before it ever came up, and so he was not subject to any criminal prosecution. He, obviously he's through publicly for anything. But there was people who were really upset about that, as is okay. I mean, you shouldn't be upset about that. These child abuse cases are really severe, and part of the problem is the effect it has on the child. And many of these girls, when I was a policeman, I used to deal with the prostitutes in Portland. Virtually all of them have been abused that you talk to when they were kids. And that disrupts their mental capacity, mental thinking so badly, and then they end up, drugs and prostitution things. And so if we can get that cycle stopped, that's really important. We're looking at drones now. You know, those are coming, and we're trying to come up with something that makes sense. We don't want too much of an invasion of privacy. There's going to be real restrictions on police use of those. I would like to see them be able to use them to go down a highway after a snowstorm, fly one down to be sure nobody's stuck out there, those kind of things. But as far as just flying around, and people are really both the super liberal people, super conservative, are joining hands on that one, and do not want to see that get out too much. And we've taken a hard look at the marijuana stuff, although in Oregon people don't go to prison unless you're selling truckloads. But we don't want people getting in trouble. It looks to me, I would guess that the public's going to make marijuana legal in November. I'm not sure that's the best idea. We had a bill where some of us were working on to ask the voters, do you want it, yes or no, and then you have the legislature write it so that it would make sense rather than having the advocates. But it looks like the advocates are going to bring that. They're going to have a lot of money to support that, and the law enforcement who don't like it aren't organized enough to combat. So on one hand, I have some concerns about that, but on the other, people are smoking marijuana all over the state already. It's not like something that isn't going on. And you can virtually get a medical marijuana card for anything. And so, we have concerns about the driving under the influence thing, but I do about alcohol as well. And I don't know, just that's kind of just an overall view, and when we get a little further, I'd be glad to answer any questions, hopefully, that I can.
All right, thank you. And what I'm going to do now is I'm actually going to read a letter, email, sent by former Superintendent Chris Brown. Some of these issues will hopefully get some questions going, perhaps lead to some more discussion, and then we'll open it up to questions. So, he starts off with, sorry I can't make it tonight. We're glad that he sent an email though. County jails continue to be the default destination for the mentally ill. Jails are perhaps the worst place for these folks. Corrections is ill-equipped to meet these people's needs, and they're often tormented by their prisoners or the noisy, chaotic environment. Many of these folks are arrested as a result of chronic nuisance sorts of things because sheriffs and chiefs suffer outrage from businesses and citizens when these people are left on the streets. And when ignored, their behavior can escalate or they can become victims themselves. They need medication supervision and specialized services from facilities designed to house them and workers trained to help them. This would be one of my priorities. So that's one. Second, and I think local school board would like to hear this as well. We need to continue to prioritize liaisons between school districts and police districts. With school resource officer programs and our safety teams comprised of educators and cops are infinitely more likely to mitigate tragedies in schools. Mitigate tragedies in schools than our districts without these relationships and regular dialogue. And while we tend to focus on K-12, colleges benefit greatly from these partnerships too. You don't need to have a cop in the hall to mitigate a disaster, but you have to be educated, rehearsed, and prepared. These district safety partnerships should be required and audited for legitimate annual activity in the form of face-to-face meetings, planning with fundamental lockdown drills when possible. The third one relates actually to Polk County, something that Representative Barker's already talked about, something that we have talked about in this district for some time, the public safety levy and the ongoing cuts going on in Polk County. He emphasizes Curry, Josephine, Coos, Polk are essentially off the rails in terms of law enforcement. The sheriffs are exhausted and OSP remains the agency that is trusted most but cannot answer all of the calls. Strategically, there is no fallback position. If the sheriffs need support or OSP needs support, but right now both appear to be somewhat crippled. The ability of Curry County to levy taxes in support of their sheriff in particular is non-existent, much like Representative Barker talked about. The state's ability to make significant differences in OSP's effectiveness will require additional funding and support at levels we haven't had for some time. Third issue, the public needs to be further engaged with public safety on a personal level. He's currently working with the Texas Department of Public Safety. Texas, by the way, though not a leader in a lot of things, on one thing they do right, they actually require public officials, all public officials, to have to take a class on emergency management. And they actually require in Texas that every county have emergency management plans, and they've actually tailored to the FEMA requirements for coding and things like that, which actually helps when there is a time of disaster. It allows citizens to enter an address and see on an app where potential sex offenders are registered in their proximity. It also provides places to go during storms, It provides support on where EMS personnel are. It was remarkably inexpensive. It gets people involved and makes the state government and state police look very competent. It is highly cost effective. These are some of the issues that, again, former state superintendent of state police, Chris Brown, suggested for discussion, and I know a couple of them are out there. One of the things I'd like to kind of throw out and just ask your opinion on, when we look at the tragedies that statistically don't happen often, but when they do are big and ugly, like we had at Reynolds High School recently, it appears that the lack of school nurses, it appears that the lack of school counselors, it appears the lack of supported levels, sustainable levels of police in terms of mitigation of it. You may not be able to prognosticate and guess what's going to happen, but once it does, at least respond quickly. That seems to be one of the things out there that people are trying to start to focus on. Do you think that's something that's...
It is, and I was supportive of an effort, and they just had their first meeting to organize to help these primarily on school issues, school emergencies like that. We want to get blueprints of the schools, so the police have them if they respond, and we want to have the police able to talk to each other, especially in a county like Polk County, where you would have several different agencies respond. We want them to be able to communicate. I live in the Beaverton district with the Hillsborough Police, which is right pretty close to where I live. On their computers in their car, they have all the school blueprints. They can call them. And I would know, like, if I was sent to, if I was down here and happened to be sent to your high school, I'd have no idea where room 211 was or whatever. And so that's the kind of thing we want the law enforcement people to have to know, and we want them working with the schools and how to respond to that. They had great response at Reynolds High School, and quick response to that issue. And I know the same thing happened. It was a little more confusing when they had the shooting at the shopping mall up in Portland a couple of Christmases ago, because the FBI responded, Clackamas County responded, the state police responded, Portland police. Everybody that was anywhere near there. And at the time, I had a son-in-law who was on the Portland Bomb Squad. He has a radio that he carries all the time. He was right there when that happened. He was one of the first people there, but he didn't know where to go because they were getting conflicting information. And if I tell you to go to Fred or to Myron Franks and you don't know what part of Myron Franks and a big mall like that. So those are the kind of things we're looking at, and that is important. And like I say, it's really a small chance of it happening, but when it does, prior to Columbine, prior to the Columbine incident, the police would contain. And when I was trained for years, you would contain an area and wait for everybody to show up. After that, with an active shooting, the police will actually have to go in and go after it. And that was a huge change, a sea change in policing in America. And prior to that incident happening, the Special Response Squad up in Portland, they have the plans for the schools. And they'd been practicing. I didn't know that at the time. But when I ran the night shifts, I had Southeast Portland my last couple of years. I was lieutenant in charge of Southeast Portland. And so I actually had my men drill and women drill, and we'd go to Cleveland High School and we would have these things saying something had happened and we would respond in an active shooter. So we had some idea what to do and who you would call, and we would go through those things, kind of practice, which helps out if you've done it a time or two, and then if you have a real thing, it's you know, kind of pre-think those things out, and you're able to proceed better. There was a couple other things they talked about. The mentally ill people in the jails is a terrible problem. Jails are not a place for mentally ill, but they do end up there. A lot of them, the ones I would see in Portland, a lot of them would have compound their problem with the alcohol and drugs, and then they would commit some crime. And sometimes they'd be physically out of control, and it would be really rough. And you cannot force somebody to take their medicine if they're out on the street, which is one of the problems. It is a problem because they have their rights. And so many times, if somebody was acting really strange and it wasn't right, I could go up to them and smile at them and talk, how you doing? And say, have you been taking your medicine? And they'd usually say, how do you know about that? And, you know, good guess. But they had quit because they either thought they were cured, thought everything was fine, they didn't need it anymore, or they didn't like the side effects. That stuff makes you lethargic, or it makes you dizzy, or whatever. And so they would quit taking it, and then they would revert back. So the mental health in America is in trouble, and we need to do something more about that. I can't remember the numbers, but there's a lot of people in the penitentiary who have a diagnosed mental illness. and they would be better off getting treatment somewhere else. The Oregon State Hospital is a very expensive place. That's about $300,000 a year for a person, so it's really, I think it's 300. It's high anyway. But people need to be treated there again if we can treat them in the community where they can be controlled safely. You know, we've had a terrible tragedy up in Columbia County where a health worker went out to visit somebody, and a senior health worker said, "I'm not going out there, that guy's crazy." So they sent the junior worker, a woman named Jennifer Warren, out there, and the guy killed her. So we don't want those kind of things happening, and nobody does. I mean, so to be sure people are medicated and so on is very important. And I was trying to think there was something else he talked about there that.
Basically the taxation.
Yeah. So, right, the tax, I don't know how you resolve the taxation. That's up to the voters to do that. In the legislature, it takes 36 votes in the House and I think 16 in the Senate to move any tax measure. It's very difficult. There's a lot of people that will have signed the "I'll never raise taxes" pledge. I voted for some tough taxes. I voted for taxes at home that I paid myself. I voted for the enhanced sheriff levy in Washington County, and always supported the schools, the libraries, and so on. But I know some people who are on fixed income and stuff, that's really tough. They're about tapped out. So those are difficult things. Curry County, where there's very few jobs, makes it very rough for people down there to vote. And there's some people just don't think, they don't believe you really need it, but it's to the point where they really need it. So.
What we're going to do, there's a couple of ideas that have come about over the last several months in conversations. I'd like to throw them out there, and then after we talk about those, we'll open them for questions from the audience. Hopefully you've written down some ideas for questions. We're going to take a quick break before we do that, but then we'll have questions. One of the ideas that has been talked about at a number of different locations has been this idea of, in terms of mental health, especially with children, that the lack of school counselors and the lack of school nurses to actually give out appropriate meds is one of the problems. For those that are watching right now and wondering, well, how many are there? How many school nurses are there? The ratio is, I understand, supposed to be about 1 to 700, so one nurse to 700 kids. And the Oregon ratio right now is about 1 to 2,100, is what I understand. So basically, you're lucky if you have a nurse in the school district, in the entire district, for a school district like Central. And what we have had and what we've seen is as classes have gotten larger and teachers have more to do in addition to teaching, sometimes it's the teacher giving out the meds, sometimes it's actually the secretary down in the office that is giving out the meds and checking up to make sure the kids are getting them. And with a lot of kids and a lot of other duties, a lot of kids don't necessarily get what they need and when they need it. In addition to that, not having enough school counselors and not having enough what I would call sentinels out there, school resource officers, folks that are in tune to the signals of something that might happen. We've in many ways continued to disinvest in parts of the school that weren't on the No Child Left Behind or the metrics that were always tested, and because of scarce resources, because of Measure 5 and 4750 and the continued spiral that have affected law enforcement and every local government, we find ourselves now in a situation where we actually know some things that can help, but finding the resources to actually do that. So what do you think in terms of, not per se increased taxes per se, but in terms of how we emphasize mental health as a priority, or perhaps how we work with the feds to try to find pilot programs or something like that? What do you think that we can do in that regard?
Well, I think one of the things, just keeping the discussion up front and having people aware of it helps a lot. I know I saw in the paper recently that Ryle High School is going to get a health clinic this year up in Benson. Some of those, they have a few of those in Portland. They've been somewhat politically controversial because people are on, I don't know whether it's birth control information, those kind of things. But these it's really important, I think, to have a nurse available to help kids. It's important to have the counselors. You know, things have changed. I went to school 50 years ago, so I know it's so totally different. There was a lot more maybe self-imposed control, but they had control. We started out, our freshman class probably had 1,200, I don't know how many kids, but we ended up with half that many when we graduated because Benson didn't have much stricter rules in the district high schools. And if kids weren't following the rules, they'd say, don't come back next year, go to your district high school. And in those days too, another thing would happen if you're going to drop out of high school, which a lot of kids did, they went into the military, where they got a job. Now the military needs to have educated people. They don't want to take, what looks like a troublemaker. I grew up in the military. I mean, I got out of high school. I wasn't ready to go to college, and went in the Marines and decided I didn't want to do that forever either. But I did my hitch in there, and I learned a lot, and it really helped me. I mean, I grew up there, came back ready to go to school. I came out, and there was in fact, when I first got out, there was no GI Bill, but after that, there was a small one. This was Vietnam era. And so I went to school and ended up graduating from Portland State, and which I would never have done out of high school. But times are different, and they need more counselors to kind of watch, especially in these big classes. I don't know how in the world teachers handle that with 50 kids or whatever. I grew up in the leading edge of the baby boom, so we always had, in my grade school, I went to Llewellyn in Portland, we always had 2 classes, 2 5th grades, 2 6th grades, and so on. We all had about 30 kids in the class, but it was different in those days. If a teacher called my parents and said I'd done something wrong, my parents didn't want to argue with the teacher. And they didn't want to listen to me saying I didn't do it. So I saw a cartoon today that said, they had they talked about helicopter moms. They showed a helicopter, and they were saying to the child walking down the street, climb aboard, and it said the way it used to be, there was a blimp flying way off saying, be home for dinner. We used to be able to go out all day and without our parents having to worry about that. You can't do that anymore. So it is important if we can get more help at schools, and especially if the kid's having trouble. I saw another report from a different state where a school was working on the bullying issue. And what they did was ask the kids, who's the bully? And all the kids know who the bully is. And so then, if they didn't go after the bully to punish him, they brought the bully in to find out what was going on and where was this coming from. A lot of times it was maybe he was being bullied at home by older brothers or older kids or something. And so they would try to get the bully's thinking turned around and see why that isn't a good idea. And probably all of us know kids who were bullies in high school who didn't really do well in life after that. They were big men on the campus in high school, but then after that, things didn't go so well for them because that doesn't work very well in real life.
Okay. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take a 5-minute break, and then we're going to come back, and hopefully this will be an opportunity for you to write down your questions, and we'll literally go to first come, first serve for the questions. So thank you. Everybody has a chance to get their seats. Okay, welcome back. This is a public safety forum being held on August 6, 2014. I want to say a couple thank yous now that we're here. First of all, thank you to the Monmouth Public Library for allowing us to rent this space and come together on an otherwise very hot day outside, but it's cool inside. And also to thank Anthony from Sweet Eats, who provided some of the meals. If you aren't familiar with Sweet Eats, you should go online and find Sweet Eats. He specializes in cupcakes and these really, really bizarre but tasty cream cheese kind of cheesecakes. So they're very good. I'm not always sure what goes in them, and sometimes I don't want to know, but they really are good. We also want to thank Representative Barker for hanging in and being here and talking about all things public safety. We have been talking largely about how the legislature can and can't sometimes fix the problems that we can see because of the nature of local taxes and some of the things that the legislature has been working on to help mitigate some of the concerns. What we'd like to do now is actually open it up to you, the audience, and we have Waylon Buchanan. He's going to be going around providing you the mic so people at home can hear what we're talking about. But we're going to open it up. What kinds of questions are on your mind about public safety? Again, it can be anything ranging from preparedness to mitigation to response to recovery, anything related to corrections, enforcement, parole, probation, mental health. This is your opportunity to ask the question.
I have 2 questions. The first one is, as someone involved in state government, how do you decide which issues that you're giving priority to work on? And the second question is, once some legislation has been passed, how do you determine the effectiveness of that particular legislation?
Thank you, those are excellent questions. So legislators can propose bills. And so I have, for instance, I have a constituent of mine who's calling me saying, I want to do something about people locking their dogs in hot cars. So we're looking into that. But any kind of a bill. And then we get it drafted. The legislative council over there will put it in the legal language. You know, you tell them, here's what I want, and they'll make it so it could be legal if it's passed. And then a lot has to do with the leadership, where they decide, sometimes they'll say, I'm not going to have that bill for whatever reason, they can stop that. Then they go out to the committees. The committee chairman has some sway on that. I could say, I don't want that bill. They may tell me to run it anyway, but they do allow chairmen of the committees a lot of leeway on those things. Then, so usually the priority, I guess it's like, what do you think is most important? And not just some personal little quirk, but what's important to the public. And then we'll run those out. So then after we pass the law, we'll get feedback on how it's working. One example was that when I was first there was a law about, you might remember this, 20-mile-an-hour speed limit in schools, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. I'd go like, no, that's crazy, that makes no sense. So I was one of 3 people who voted no, because it was the school safety, child safety bill. Who's going to vote against the child safety bill? That one got a lot of flack. We took, changed that the next year and the next session, so 2 years later. But the people do look at those. They see how they're working or not working, and then they can change it. Now that we have a short session every other year, we have a 1-month session. We're correcting some of those bills we see as a mistake in that short session. It's kind of housekeeping.
Other questions?
Yes.
Thank you. Hey, it's on. All right. I'm Rick Ritter, supporter of Paul Evans and a general gadfly. My concept is, and I don't know if it's backed really by hard data, that we support public safety at the county level through county property taxes. And the counties that don't have a lot of private property to tax basically tend to get bled dry. They simply don't get the levies passed to support public safety. Why doesn't the state of Oregon pick up property taxation so that on a per capita basis, public safety is supported on a somewhat equitable level across the state so that the rural counties aren't dying from lack of support?
So one of the problems is that those counties, Curry County, Josephine County, pay 56 cents a thousand is their millage rate, and they won't raise that. So that's bad. I mean, I pay a whole lot more than that where I live, and I'm not objecting to paying it. And I personally believe taxes is how we live in a civilized society, how we have our good roads and things. There's the tax limitations are in the Constitution that people pass Measure 5, and so you can't just tax it more. I mean, and there's limits on that. So people in Portland, they pass bonds, and it squeezes everything down because you can only get so much. And they approve a bond that exceeds that. The property owner isn't paying that full amount. If you're below that, you end up paying it. So the taxes are pretty complicated, and it's very difficult to impose for me to, like for us, to tell Curry County what they have to do. I would think they'd be willing to pay more, but they say there's no jobs down here, a lot of that land is federal land in their counties, and so it makes it very difficult. But the fact that those things are in the Constitution by the voters, those initiatives, really make it difficult to do anything about. The public would have to change that.
One of the things that's kind of background to Oregon taxation is a former mayor and a former school member that dealt with local perspectives, is that because many people talk about it, the three-legged stool as far as state taxation, income tax, property tax, and sales tax. In many states, the sales tax is kind of the great equalizer because it's not locally levied. You can use that as butter, and you can spread it around, and you can do things like that. We have a heritage here of very local control, and even one might argue this distrust of centralized government because we have, as we've talked about many times, sitting here in Monmouth, we're a member of at least 12 or 13 different governments with 12 or 13 different bureaucracies and 12 or 13 different world visions. That's good in terms of attention to detail and concern about that particular mission. It's not always good in coordination of funds. It's not always good in agreeing on how you're going to spend the money. And until we get around Measure 5, Measure 4750, which really is an artificial constraint on whatever anybody wants to do, we probably can't get to a statewide solution. Many people say, well, if you just throw a sales tax on it, you can do that. The problem is most people in Oregon right now wouldn't, I don't suspect, trust government in general with more revenues without some limitation on income tax or some constraint on property tax. And we have a one-issue standard in the state of Oregon. The courts have said that you can only attack one problem at a time in a ballot measure, which limits the ability to tie a solution to other types of mechanisms. So there's going to have to be a larger discussion about how we're going to really recast our entire tax system at some point, not just in one piece or the other. But you're right in that a citizen in Harney County should generally have the same right to justice as a citizen in Multnomah County or a citizen in Curry County.
And yeah, that's really kind of the whole sums it up. So I don't know what the solution is, but we got to find one.
Other questions?
One thing I was going to mention that I didn't mention earlier that I kind of forgot about was the sex offender registration. In Oregon, there's certain crimes that require lifetime registration as a sex offender. That makes it difficult for a house, difficult for a job, and so on. We're trying to take a look at that because there's about 20,000 people are registered sex offenders in Oregon. Some of them really don't, it's somebody that may have had the Romeo Juliet thing, they were 18, the girl was 16. She was 15, they'd be in trouble, serious trouble. And so some of those people are not really a danger and they don't need much supervision. And there are some people that are really dangerous and need a lot of supervision. So we want to try to get that broken down into some classifications so that the people that control that manage the sex offenders can spend more time with the dangerous people and not spend so much time, waste so much time on people who aren't really dangerous. We're taking a hard look at juvenile sex offender. Sometimes people have committed a crime when they were kids. It doesn't come out until later, maybe 10 years later. And so, should we be registering those people for life? And so that's something we want to take a look at. And again, I'm worried about the safety. My lifetime as a policeman, 31 years on the street. I started with the Oregon State Police, ended up in Portland. I dealt with the victims so much. And I always think about the victims. Other people say, well, this guy's in jail and it costs a lot of money. And I remember I was on vacation a couple of years ago down in Indio, California, and I went to a Starbucks, and there was a woman in her 80s who was in there crying. So I said, are you okay? Is something wrong? She'd just been carjacked. Some guy stuck a gun to her head, taken her purse, taken her car. She'll never feel safe the rest of her life. She's terrorized, and those kind of things have a terrible effect on people. The victims, people working at the bank, they've been robbed. Some of them can't go back to work. I mean, they have the post-traumatic stress from those things. And so I want to prevent the crime from happening, but I'm not too sympathetic to people, especially with violent crime. I'm willing to spend the money for that.
Yes, sir.
I'd like to go back to, Mike?
Yeah. We'll get you a mic.
I'd like to go back to Rick's question about funding for public safety and get some clarification on some issues. So a couple of decades ago, I think we did transform public education from being basically locally funded to state funded. So we overcame that barrier with public education. Then with regard to the counties in the Southwest, which I guess had their property taxes subsidized or whatever, offset by logging revenues back in the 90s when Measure 5 passed. But they did recently have some initiatives which they voted down, and I didn't know whether that was a bond measure or what it was, but I think it was to fund public safety. So is that, so are they allowed to do it in spite of Measure 5 and they just turned down the opportunity?
Yeah, they could have had their own levy, and they didn't. And for I don't know all the reasons, but I mean, some people argue they have enough money already, and after, one of the things when they had the timber jobs, there was good jobs. There was people making good money, good family wage jobs. Those are gone, and they're never coming back, I don't think. But in the meantime, the feds paid money in lieu of taxes to kind of offset that timber. But that's a national issue, and so Congress is saying enough of that. I mean, our Oregon people are fighting for it, and Washington and so on. But that's getting reduced more and more. But every time they've told the people down there, you're going to lose that money, it comes through, and so they don't believe it anymore. They don't think the edge of the cliff is there yet. I think it's part of that problem because DeFazio and Berkeley and Ron Wyden and Greg Bolden all work very hard to keep that money coming to Oregon. And so that's part of the problem. The public education thing leveled out. The people in Portland thought they were paying too much taxes, and that was Multnomah County really carried that education bill, the Measure 5 thing, to spread that out. And some places like down in Central Point who had no money suddenly were flush with money, a lot more money than they knew what to do with. But now the money I pay in Beaverton, probably, I'm guessing at least 25 cents every dollar I pay for my local school taxes goes out. But I want the kid in Curry County to have a great education too. I'm not opposed to that. But so I can see the same kind of point with police, law enforcement issues, but I'm not quite sure how we can do that. That was, yeah.
Just want to follow up on it.
Okay.
Something that happened also with when that transition happened about the Measure 5 in education is that the state, in order to make up those costs on the income tax general fund revenue side, started pushing more education at the expense of higher ed, at the expense of public safety, at the expense of other things. So what happened was all animals were equal, but one animal was more equal than others in terms of K-12 over everything else. Because with the Measure 5, at least, once we locked it in the $1990, what Measure 4750 on top of 5 what the permanent rate did was it locked it in at 3% growth. So that if you look back in terms of 20-year history now, you can basically look at between an easy estimate would be 500 million. A higher estimate is about $2 billion in lost revenue that we couldn't tax ourselves that we would have under the old before Measure 5 system in all revenues. And because things slid over mostly toward K-12, which I think most people agreed was important, we were forced in many ways to live off federal dollars and other gimmicks to basically keep Humpty Dumpty together as long as we could. The fundamental truth is absolutely what I think Representative Barker has emphasized. In those areas that were natural resources dependent, especially federal property natural resource dependent, when the forests were under national policies and national priorities, when the policies were changed, there was a great lie that was spread around the Northwest. And that great lie was, well, as soon as government gets out of the way, we'll go back into the mills and start cutting again. And we know over the last 15, 20 years that federal policy has actually incentivized a lot of companies to not just sell equipment, but actually sell what used to be in the mills. I'm convinced right now if you actually had a forester come out and say, go ahead, open up the forests, there's no mills to go back to like there used to be because we were actually giving tax incentives to companies to send those mills across the pond. So how does that relate to our situation here? People are waiting for a solution that is either going to be continued federal largesse, which can't happen when we're at $17 trillion in debt, or they're going to have to adjust expectations. And that adjustment has been a long time coming because of the, in my opinion, falsehood of the jobs are coming back because we couldn't have them even if we wanted to. And the second piece is that the federal dollars will always be there. They won't always be there. So your point about these levies that were failed, in many ways, they're in their mindset, from at least conversations I've had with folks down there, they're not going to be paying that amount of money for public safety until they get a good middle-class job again, which unless we get really creative in terms of reinventing our economy, is never going to happen again there because of the dynamics. I don't know if that helps answer the question.
And when I was in the state police in 1970, and I think we had probably twice as many state police then as they do today. They were funded out of the highway fund at the time, and then there was some lawsuit saying that cannot be, it can only go for highway. So they lost that, and they've been way behind ever since. I mean, I fought hard since I've been in the legislature trying to get more money into the Oregon State Police to keep that, well equipped. Everybody depends on the state police crime labs. All the police do. They some of the cities you part of used to have their own, but then the state took over all of that, which makes sense. There's no sense in having little labs that can do some things, and you can have the state police labs can do virtually everything and do it well. And but I could see the fall off of the number of troopers on the road. We used to be out there all the time. They're not anymore. During the years in I think maybe early 90s, I had a daughter going to school down in Los Angeles, and so I'd make that trip down I-5 probably 4 or 5 times a year. And sometimes I would never see an Oregon State police car from Portland to the border. I'd see a lot of California, and when I go to Seattle, I see a lot of Washington Patrol. And that's not good. We need people out there just to help you if you break down, or those kind of things. But so we're still working on that, trying to come up with a solution. There's been proposals to. Somebody one time said, well, I have a plan. We'll take away the money that pays to put ramps on disabled people's homes and to give them to the state police. So yeah, I don't think so. Yeah.
One of the things that's sometimes hard on when you talk about public safety, and it's hard for people sometimes to accept this because it seems kind of odd, but county sheriffs are required to maintain the jail at the expense of patrol. And so, to use your school analogy again, it's very similar to saying, all right, well, we're going to constrain resources and then give me your left hand, and it can only be used for these functions. Then, if there's money enough that you have a full left hand, then you can actually have the right. And what happens, especially in rural areas, the jail is an important function, but perhaps you could have a regional jail. And counties are trying to contract with that, but there's some laws and there's some expectations in the way, so that eventually I think what may happen is we may end up rethinking what a county does in terms of law enforcement and the role of sheriff in certain counties, which is not terribly popular with certain elements, especially sheriffs. Yeah. But the delivery of services, unless the language changes, we're going to probably have to look at just changing delivery unless we can, which I think is the larger solution for most of public safety, have a more vibrant economy that's building small business and trying to compete in the 21st century, so we can perhaps bring back living wage jobs that aren't exactly the same kinds of jobs that people were expecting. But that's a thought. Is that?
Yeah, that helps a whole lot. Just one further follow-up observation. Polk County had a public safety levy in November that went down, and then in May we had a certain fire districts had a levy that passed, I think, fairly handily. I wasn't paying a whole lot of attention other than voting for both of them. Would it be possible that there was a reaction against the public safety levy going down, and that maybe brought the fire levy through, or?
And I have no idea. I don't know what happened locally, but of course, I think everybody understands the importance of the fire department. And I know in my neck of the woods, I have an application on my cell phone. I don't remember the name of it, but if I'm near a heart attack, I'll get notified with Tualatin Valley Fire and Rescue. And so I know CPR, so I can help. But I can look on there and see what's going on. Almost all of their calls are medical calls. Virtually every one of their calls, the fire department calls. They've done such a good job with fire prevention. They almost put themselves out of work, but now they do the medical. And it's great to have that AMP role in their great service. And so I think people are aware of that. And you want to have, if you have a fire, you need to have a fire department there. I had my house catch fire a few years ago, and more than a few, but it was snowing. And I went out to take a picture. I saw smoke coming from where the wood still was, and I thought, that doesn't look right. And I thought, maybe it's just because of the snow. And I knew that wasn't what it was. I ran around my house on fire. And the fire department wasn't too far away, but it took a long, seemed like an awfully long time to get there. I grabbed the hose from under the snow and hooked it up and turned it on, and it was the silver hose. So I actually got the fire out before they got there, but I caught it early enough. But, I think everybody recognizes the importance of firefighters. We just were talking a little bit during the break about the importance of volunteer firefighters, which nationally I think they're the vast bulk of firefighters, especially in rural areas. And so there's always this tension between the professional firefighters and the volunteers, and we need to come up with some kind of a solution to that problem so they can work together. And I know Paul Evans has talked about maybe some kind of ratio, so many professional firefighters, and then you can add so many volunteers. And of course, the professional firefighters are afraid they'll kind of do their job. So the volunteers don't want to do that. Volunteers are there to help. And we also need to do more to incentivize, to make it easier on the people that do that. I remember several years ago, boy, or several, a friend of mine was a volunteer firefighter. He said he had a great, at the time, a $10,000 life insurance policy that he didn't have himself. And I mean, from his other job, which was the Oregon State Police. And those kind of things help. And just people deserve to get they get good training in Oregon. We have some good training facilities. The Department of Public Safety Standards and Training goes out and trains out in the field, which is helpful instead of having to make people come in. Because that's very expensive. It's expensive if you're a volunteer firefighter and you have a job, you have to leave your job and not get paid to do that. It doesn't work. And I lived for a while in Scappoose, Oregon. We had a volunteer fire department out there. It was really good. A lot of the people were involved in that, both in the EMT side and on the firefighting side.
With this public safety levy that was going on also, I think what happens is when there are many levies on the ballot, what generally happens with Oregonians is we'll look at 4 or 5 and we'll say, all right, the top 2 or 3, yes, and then the other 2, no, just so I can be responsible with the public funds. And sometimes the messages, when they're a little bit conflicting, end up at the lower priority. And I know that the sheriff at Polk County right now is working very diligently to help explain to the current members of the commission that the messages in the future, should there be another bond, which no one is saying that there will be another bond or levy election, but if there is, that the messages will be very clear and precise and clean, because Sheriff Wolf has worked very hard to try and make as much of the resources that he has. And I know he was very frustrated with the way that the electorate was given that choice. He wasn't actually very frustrated with the public. He was very frustrated with the way in which the messages were put out there. And I know that they are talking through the process, what's the appropriate way to move forward. The thing is, there's this really weird reality that the public sometimes thinks, well, if the government puts out a bond or a levy and doesn't get what they want, then they're going to try to punish people and basically make them hurt. And I'm not going to say that that hasn't happened in the past. I am going to say that I believe, and I think Representative Barker would agree with this one, is that every time there's a bond or a levy measure put in front of the people, it's not always about the bond or levy, it's about whether or not people have trust in the government. And that trust reservoir, when it is full, people will support them. When it is not as full as it used to be, they're a little reticent to trust and follow that with more payments, especially in a hard economic time. So I think you're absolutely right. I think that the one was a reaction to the other, and people said, well, actually, we do care about public safety. And I think that the good news is that there's been a lot of discussion about what we have lost in terms of capacity. There's been a lot of discussion about what's going on good in Polk County despite the cuts, and there's also, I think, going to be a lot more discussion about what could be going on in Polk County if we actually had restoration of some of the funds. The fact that we've had news story after news story of deputies leaving Polk County for other places before they got laid off, I think adds credibility to, boy, things are actually kind of getting bad, we have to fix this. But, you know, to me, the best part about the way Oregon functions with the state legislature setting policy and trying to provide macro solutions, and that tension between the local governments that have certain authorities and certain responsibilities, is trying to find, really from 2 different vantage points, the best way to provide a service. And the cool part is that with the right attitude and the right level of trust in the government, we can actually find some creative solutions that maybe we haven't ever done before. And I think in public safety, we're going to have to get there. The one thing we haven't really talked about yet tonight, but hopefully in the future we can, is seismic resiliency, which is one of those things that it's the great white shark that no one is talking about because of the Cascadia subduction zone. And the fact that we, on a 300-year clock, I believe are now 2 or 3 years over the 300-year clock. And if you don't know what liquefaction is, if you're at home and you're bored and you're watching this, Google liquefaction, and then don't get too scared, just recognize that liquefaction can happen, and that living so close to the beautiful Pacific coast does have some rigors, one of which is, of course, that potential for tsunami and seismic destruction. And as we start wrapping together a public safety program, we have to be careful to not just focus so much on the here and now, even though the need is great, but we also need to be careful about how we invest for the future, and that's one of the challenges.
Again, I just want to thank everybody for taking your night to come out here. It is important, and I really appreciate the fact that you've come out. It's been great, and I've enjoyed being down. Thank you.
And I want to thank Representative Barker for driving down from Loyola to be a part of this event tonight. For those of you that still have questions about public safety, after this, we'll have a couple minutes before Representative Barker has to get in the car. But you can always email us, paul@paulevans.org, for more information on these types of issues. And again, thank you very much for coming out. Hopefully, you've at least had an opportunity to listen to the representatives who have been making the decisions and helping guide policy. And again, thank you for playing a part in the community and actually showing that you want to move us forward, because not everybody takes the time to do that. So thank you. Give yourself a round of applause. Have a good night.